Um, Good evening. To you, it's evening. Here, it's still afternoon. And Chag Shavuot Sameach, almost. And I think we have a very appropriate topic for Shavuot, since Shavuot commemorates the giving of the Torah. I'm going to talk about not just the Torah, but how Jewish law works. And this talk is an introduction to the talks I'll be giving starting in a couple of weeks on how Jewish law looks at various issues in contemporary medicine and medical ethics. But first, I think you have to understand how Jewish law works. So, Dominika, if you could put on screen, please, the chart of the evolution of Jewish law. Thank you. Perfect. So let's start with the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, according to Jewish tradition, given to Moses at Mount Sinai on Shavuot, and then transmitted down through the generations. And this is called, in Hebrew, Torah Shebichtav, the written law. Written down by Moses. Now, according to tradition, along with all the laws in the Torah, there was a kind of handbook given to Moses of oral explanations that he did not write down, called Torah Sheba'al Peh, literally the Torah of the mouth, or in English, it's sometimes called oral law. And that was transmitted down through the generations until it was edited by a man named Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, around 200 CE in the Common Era in the land of Israel. If you look at a lot of the laws in the Torah, they are very brief, they're very succinct, and they don't go much into detail. Let's take, for example, one of the very important laws in the Torah, to observe Shabbat. There's very little in the Torah, or for that matter, the other books in the Bible, about how to observe Shabbat, either the do's or the don'ts. And so through the generations, various laws and traditions were compiled about observance of Shabbat until they were written down in the Mishnah. Now that is the traditional explanation. And there are, of course, historical explanations for how this happened. If you look at the literature between the time of the conclusion of the Torah and the Bible and the Mishnah, there's several hundred years missing. In those several hundred years, there was a lot of Jewish literature that didn't become part of the Bible. Most importantly, there's a group of documents that some of you may have heard of called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, written by a group of people that lived a life in isolation in the desert. There are all kinds of interpretations of laws, of Shabbat and other things. Also, in other books from this period that aren't part of Jewish sacred scripture, like a book called the Book of Jubilees, which was written around the same time as the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's also laws. The point I'm trying to make is the laws evolved during this period because people had to comment on the Torah in order to carry it out. They had to expand and explain the laws in the Torah. So that's the historical evolution. The traditional belief was that they were all given to Moses. The modern critical belief is that these laws were compiled over the generations to explain the existing laws in the Torah, to expound upon them, and sometimes expand and sometimes limit the laws until they were compiled in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is in Hebrew. It's not the same kind of Hebrew as the Bible because languages change, just like modern Polish is different from medieval Polish. But it is in Hebrew, and it was divided into 6 orders or seders, compiling different areas of Jewish law. And even though by the time it was written down in the year 200, some of these areas of the law were no longer in effect. Some of them had to do, for example, a lot of them had to do with the temple, which was destroyed in the year 70. So all those laws couldn't be carried out, but they were compiled in the Mishnah. So laws about sacrifices and ritual purity, many of which could not be observed anymore since the temple was destroyed, were still included in the Mishnah. Now, when people think of religion, and maybe this isn't true so much in Poland, but it's certainly true in America, they think of religious law. They think of things that have to do with rituals, prayers, holiday observances, etc. But in the Torah, there's also a lot of laws that have to do with civil society, laws of damages. In the Torah, it's what happens if you dig a pit on your property, or hole in your property, and somebody falls in, or your ox gores another ox and damages it, or kills it, or even kills a person, right? We have laws in secular society that govern these things, civil laws. So these laws that are in the Torah are greatly expanded in the Mishnah. And not only are there laws about damages, but there's also laws about judicial procedures, how you examine witnesses, what witnesses have to say, what constitutes evidence. All those things are included in the Mishnah, as well as religious laws about prayers and holidays, plus one other area of law, marriage and divorce. Those are mentioned very briefly, actually, in the Torah, but there are many laws that are compiled in the Mishnah. Now, the Torah is like the constitution of the Jewish people. These are the basic laws. And then, like in any legal system, many other laws were added afterwards. Okay, let me pause and see if there are any questions so far. All right. So the Mishnah reads like a law code. It's very brief. It says what the law is. But what's interesting about a Mishnah that would be different from the secular law code is that it also sometimes gives the minority opinion, meaning it'll say that the law is like the majority, but then it also says Rabbi X, who's a solitary opinion, says the law is Z. So that's unusual. If you looked at a secular law code in Poland or the United States, it states what the law is, but it doesn't give the minority opinion. It doesn't give what the people that got outvoted say. But that's one of the interesting things about the Mishnah. And sometimes also it gives commentary on biblical verses, and it also tells stories. The law is called in Hebrew, you have this in another sheet. Dominika, if you could present the other sheet just briefly, called Rabbinic Period Vocabulary. Perfect, thank you. So you have halacha, which comes from a word meaning to walk or the way, but you also have non-legal material that's in the Mishnah, and later on we'll see it's also in the Gemara, called Agadah, narrative, non-legal literature, often commentaries about stories in the Bible. Sometimes those things are also embedded in the Mishnah. Now, Dominika, if you could please switch back to the evolution of Jewish law. Okay, so we're done with the Mishnah, but the Mishnah is very terse, it's very brief. And what is often missing from the Mishnah is, so you say it's from the Torah, but what verses in the Torah? The Mishnah usually doesn't quote the verses that the laws are supposed to be based on. It just says what the law is. The Gemara, which comes from a Hebrew and Aramaic word like Mishnah, meaning to learn, probes the Mishnah. And first of all, the usual question one wants to ask is, where do they get this from? What verses in the Bible is this from? And they take the law in the Mishnah and they cut it into little pieces and argue about it back and forth, all the possible combinations, all the possible possibilities. The Gemara is written not in Hebrew, but in Aramaic, a language closely related to Hebrew, which most people in the Middle East spoke at this time. The two centers of Jewish life during this period were in the land of Israel and in Babylonia, which is present-day Iraq. And because of conditions in the land of Israel, which economically and politically deteriorated because the Jews revolted not once, but twice against the Romans. First in 66 CE, that resulted in the destruction of the Second Temple in 70, and then again in 132 to 135. Many people left the land of Israel because the land was economically devastated. So the center of Jewish life shifted to Babylonia, which is present-day Iraq. There were two commentaries written on the Mishnah. One in the land of Israel, which is called the Gemara of Jerusalem, or the Yerushalmi, and it was written or compiled around the year 400 CE. And the other one, because it was written in Babylonia, is called the Babylonian Gemara. And it's much larger and becomes more significant because the center of Jewish life shifted to Babylonia. It's where most of the Jews lived and became the center of the Jewish world, especially after the Arab Muslims took it over and made it the center of their empire in the 7th century. And it became the more important of the two Gemaras, the Babylonian Gemara. Together with the Mishnah and the Gemara together are called the Talmud, another word that comes from the word to learn. Now, what's in the Gemara? As I mentioned already, explanations of the Mishnah, but a lot of extraneous comments. It's not written in a style that we would be used to in common Western discourse. It's almost stream of consciousness, where one subject leads to another. It's as if somebody went through with a tape recorder into the rabbinic academies of this period, from 200 to about 600 CE of the Common Era, recorded their conversations and discussions, and then edited it. So it's a very dialogical document. It reads like a conversation back and forth. So, and they get off topic. They talk about everything under the sun. There are jokes. There are stories about the rabbis. There are comments about biblical stories, Agadah, which I mentioned already, which is related to the word that for the book we read at the Seder, the Haggadah. So there is a lot of material in the Talmud that has nothing to do with the Mishnah. It's not an easy work to follow because it's kind of all over. It's all over the place. And often they don't decide on a conclusion. They don't decide on the law. They're more interested in the arguments and the dialogue back and forth than what the law is. Now, I want to show you, Dominic, if you could change to the page of Talmud. Thank you. Perfect. All right, so this is a page from the Babylonian Talmud. One of the things that makes it difficult is it's written without vowels. Normally Hebrew or Aramaic has vowels, and without punctuation. So that makes it difficult. It's, again, kind of stream of consciousness. This is a page from the standard edition of the Talmud from Masechet Megillah, the tractate that's called Megillah, that largely has to do with the laws of Purim and reading the scroll of Esther, but it also has a lot of laws about prayer in it. For example, how we read the Torah, and a lot of the prayers we say, and the order of the service. A lot of this is mentioned in this particular tractate of the Talmud. Because the Talmud is so difficult to understand, and I tried to look up, it exists in many different English translations. I tried to look up online today to see if it had been translated into Polish, and I couldn't find that out. It would be interesting to know if there's ever a complete translation of the Talmud in Polish. Many commentaries written across the generations. I'm not going to go over all of them. On the inside of the page, looking at the screen on the right-hand side, is the most important commentary on the Talmud, Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, who lived in the 11th century in France. He also wrote a commentary on almost the whole of the Bible. And he explains all the phrases that he considers to be difficult, almost sometimes word by word in the Talmud. On the other side of the page is a commentary called the Tosafot. And when we go back to the Evolution of Jewish Law page, you'll see them mentioned. Many of these people were descendants of Rashi, some of them his own grandchildren, some of them just rabbis who lived during this period, the 12th and 13th century in what is now France and Germany. Sometimes his grandchildren argue with grandpa. They don't agree with him. And they, unlike Rashi, who really tries to understand difficult words and phrases, kind of go all over the place and compare one part of the Talmud to the other. So those are the two main commentaries There are many others that you see in the margins, and some of them in the back of the Talmud of a standard edition. Okay. We can go back to the page of the evolution of Jewish law, please. Okay. The Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud or the Babylonian Gemara, is a huge, huge work. It takes a lifetime to go through it thoroughly. If you had a whole table and you had an English Hebrew edition, it would occupy a whole table, let's say 26 volumes. Some people study the Talmud every day. And in fact, there's a program where you can go through the whole Talmud page by page in the course of 7 years. You have to do 2 folio pages a day, which is a lot, which means there's the way the Talmud is, I'll show you in a minute, labeled. There's a side A and a side B of each page. You have to do that every page, side A and side B, every day for 7 years, and then you finish it. There was a big ceremony this past fall. It was done. They filled a football stadium in New York. There were so many people there, and it was done. There were ceremonies all over the world, and now it's becoming very popular to do this. Yes, thank you. It's called Daf Yomi, the daily page, and it was started right in Poland by a rabbi from Lublin. He started it. The Talmud, however, again, is not an easy document to read. Even if you had a Polish or English translation, you would need a commentary in order to understand it. It's not easy to go through. And you can't always find out what the law is if you look at the Talmud. So for this reason, people started to write digest. Thank you, Merrick. People started to write digests of the laws in the Talmud. So if somebody wanted to just look up the law without looking all the give and take and the arguments in the Talmud, they could find it out what it was. The first person to do this was the great medieval scholar Maimonides, who lived in Egypt in the 12th century. He wrote a code of Jewish law, and he included everything, again, including laws that were no longer in effect, the laws pertaining to the temple, and organized it along his own principles, not the way the Talmud was organized it. And he called this in a very daring way, he called it the Mishnah Torah, the second Torah, meaning if you need this, you don't need anything else. He was, if nothing, very self-confident. But people took him to task. They criticized him. Why? Maimonides didn't footnote. He didn't always say, in fact, he usually did not say where in the Talmud he got his conclusions from as to what the law was. So again, people turned around and wrote commentaries on the Mishnah Torah to explain his reasoning. There were several other law codes in the intervening centuries. And then along came a man named Joseph Caro, who lived in the land of Israel in the 16th century. And he wrote a law code largely based on Maimonides, called the Shulchan Aruch, the prepared table. There was another fellow who was working on the law code at the same time, but Caro beat him to it. Now, Caro reflected the traditions of Sephardic Jews, whereas Ashkenazi Jews had different traditions. And so a rabbi who was trying to write a law code at the same time, and as I said, Caro printed his first, wrote a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, very cleverly called the mapa, the tablecloth. The tablecloth on the prepared table that explained all the Ashkenazi traditions, and in turn, people wrote commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, and people have been writing codes and commentaries down to this day. In addition to all this, and the books I'm talking about, everybody who goes to rabbinical school, whether they're Orthodox, conservative, or Reform, all study the Talmud, and they all study the codes like the Mishnah Torah and the Shulchan Aruch. That's like the standard curriculum at any rabbinical school, regardless of the denomination. Rabbis would get questions down through the ages, complicated questions that they had to look up, questions of new issues that came up because of new conditions. And they wrote answers on the basis of existing law. All legal systems, secular or religious, are inherently conservative, and law is usually based on precedent. So you have to try and find a precedent, something that is like, analogous, the new situation you deal with, and you reason by analogy that the old law should apply to this new situation. These rabbinic laws, the rabbinic responses, are called tshuvot. In Hebrew, answers. They're like, if there are any lawyers listening in, legal briefs, like what a lawyer has to submit to the court. And through the ages, dating from the period right after the Talmud to now, there are literally thousands of them. Fortunately, a lot of them have been digitized. So there's this wonderful thing called the Bar Ilan Index of Responsa, where if you're doing research on Jewish law on a topic, you can look it up because it's been digitized. You look up the topic and you see all the people that have been written on it. So, for example, the questions that we're going to be looking at starting in a couple of weeks about Jewish medical ethics. When is it permitted, according to Jewish law, to disconnect a person from a ventilator? And clearly, they didn't have ventilators, breathing machines in ancient times. You have to try and find some sort of analogy in the older laws and reason to whether it applies to this new situation with a new technology, or take something less controversial. Electricity. When electricity first came around, the question was, could it be used on Shabbat or not? After all, it says in the Torah, you're not allowed to light a fire on Shabbat. But is using electricity lighting a fire or not? Even among the Orthodox, there was a lively debate about that for a number of years, whether you could use electricity on Shabbat. It was a new technology, and people wrote tshuvot, this responsa literature, which is, again, voluminous, volumes and volumes, and it's still being written to this day. For example, on coronavirus, All kinds of questions have come up. Besides the medical questions, ritual questions. How do you do a funeral with coronavirus? How do you do a wedding when you can't have people get together? How do you do a brit milah? How do you do a circumcision? All these questions, rabbis from the different movements, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, have been answering in the age of the pandemic. Now, okay, so I've chewed off a big piece here. Let me see if there are any questions besides Merrick's comments. Any questions? Okay. Dominica, you can take down the chart, please. Thank you very much for showing it. Okay. So there's one other thing before I talk about how Jewish law is decided, I thought I would show you what a page, an old volume of the Talmud. I hope you can see this okay. When I show it to the camera. This is from 1895 was published in Vilna, which was Vilnius today, a great center of Jewish life. Here you can see it. I don't know how well you can see it. Here again is the sample page of Talmud that I showed before. Oh, oops, sorry, that's not the sample page. What a page of Talmud looks like. And then in the back, many, many more commentaries. And one other interesting thing, I think I'm correct about this. I don't read Russian, maybe somebody here does, but this was printed during the time of Tsarist Russia. And every book, including all the Jewish books, had to pass through censorship. And this, I believe, is the censor's mark that says that the book is okay. I don't know how well you're going to be able to see it on the camera. I think that's what this is, that this is okay to distribute this book. So that's a Talmud from over 100 years ago. Now, who gets to decide what the law is? And I want to go through Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform in discussing this. First of all, let's go back to the Talmud itself. As I said before, there are lots of arguments in the Talmud, and sometimes the decisions, it doesn't say what the law is like. But the rabbis, towards the end of the Talmudic period, came up with a few rules. One is usually, and there are exceptions to this, the majority rules. The other is, if it's a dispute between certain rabbis or certain schools of thought, in certain kind of cases, one school of thought wins, and other kinds of cases, another school of thought wins. For example, two of the most famous schools from the early rabbinic period are the schools of Hillel and the schools of Shammai. And the rabbis decided in favor of the schools of Hillel, that their view of the law was correct in most cases, but there was exceptions where the school of Shammai was correct, and they listed those laws. So there is, I want to use a modern term here, a certain amount of pluralism embedded in the system, a certain amount of flexibility. Now, there are limits to that. I always like to say, you know, there's flexibility, but you can't make a pig kosher. And not to that extent. there are limits. There are red lines that you can't go beyond. But there is pluralism in the system. So who decides what the law is? So let's start with the reform movement. Reform movement in the United States has a law committee that decides what the rules are for the reform movement. For the reform movement, as I'm sure you all know, not all of traditional Jewish law is binding, but it's not every man for themselves. There are rules that you have to follow. So in the United States, the law committee of the reform movement decides those rules. In Europe, the reform movement there has its own Beit Din, as I'm sure many of you know, its own law court that decides the rules. And the reform movement in Israel has yet another committee to decide the rules for the law committee in Israel. Same thing for the conservative movement, which I'm a part of. There's a law committee in the United States which decides the rules. For example, there's been a big controversy in the United States among conservative and Orthodox Jews when it came to the Seder, whether to permit Zoom Seders or not. Many people who are alone could be very isolated, very lonely. It would be very difficult for them. They couldn't go to, because of the pandemic, to friends and family. Are you gonna leave them all by themselves to have a Seder by themselves? Are you gonna permit them to do Zoom for the Seder or not? And even some Orthodox rabbis in Israel said it was permitted if you turned on the Zoom ahead of time and didn't touch the dials before the holiday started. So this was a controversy in America and Israel. And it's an ongoing controversy, what you can use Zoom for or not, particularly for the conservative and Orthodox movements. So the conservative movement has a law committee in the United States and one in Israel, and sometimes they don't agree with each other. What about the Orthodox? The Orthodox have a lot of different divisions among themselves. There is a chief rabbi, an Ashkenazi chief rabbi in Israel, and a Sephardic chief rabbi in Israel, but not everybody follows what they say. The more right-wing Orthodox groups in Israel, the Haredim, do not follow what the chief rabbinate says. And they don't have one law committee. The way it works, sometimes in the United States and in Israel, and this is true through the ages, it depends on the individual authority of a rabbi, how much weight they carry. In other words, if a rabbi gets a reputation as a great scholar, even if he's not a part of his institution, people are going to follow what he's got to say. And this is very much true in the Orthodox world, both the modern Orthodox world and the more right-wing or Haredi Orthodox world. And the modern Orthodox, by the way, also have their own Beit Din in America. So that's how law is made. A person who makes legal decisions has a particular title in Hebrew. That person is called a posek, and the plural is poskim, legal decisors. So I hope this has been a nice little introduction to Jewish law. It's as complicated as this may seem, it's a lot more complicated in reality. I just wanted to give you the chapter headings so you have some kind of introduction to Jewish law. And this will be helpful when we start looking at the medical ethics issues in 2 weeks. So again.